If you're watching this video, you're probably either an autofill jungler or you're playing the role for the very first time. In both of these cases, that's totally cool with me because the whole point of this video is to give you guys a crash course on basically everything you need to know for the first 5 minutes knowing as a jungler, which I would argue is the most crucial part of jungling in general. So I have a lecture here that I've produced that helps you basically build a mental model for how jungling works in the early game so that you can probably use it to fuel your games with any champion and and any patch, things like that. It's supposed to be really replicable and help you get the baseline for how to jungle. So this is the deck. It's called the first path. This is what I used to teach several players in order to understand the first 4 minutes as a jungler. These are the very most important minutes to learn when you're playing a role like jungle, and even when you're a laner and understanding how jungle works, because both of these things need to be true in order for you to become a better player. So the whole point of this guide is to help you understand and go kind of get a crash course on what junglers think about on a high level so that you can kind of do the same and build that process into your head when you play the role as well. So let's get started. The first path pretty much helps establish an early game plan for junglers, right? Like I said, it's all about planning, building an early game understanding, thinking about what champions are in the game, what champion you're playing, what your champion likes, what other champions don't like. Games can literally be won or lost off the first clear, as you probably have felt from solo queue. So it's really important to acknowledge this and both hedge against potential risks from your team, but also take advantage of potential opportunities for your own team as well. So this is the dichotomy of jungling in the early game, and there's a lot of different chains and decision making that can go into it. It's actually very, very fun if you can kind of understand that this is the dynamic you're thinking of. So this ties into things like waves, matchups, compositions, winning conditions, like the whole shebang. So if you understand this, honestly, you kind of at a certain level sort of understand the fundamentals of early game League of Legends. So let's talk about establishing a game plan first. This starts before you load into game, like before the game even starts, right? You need to load into champion select, and when you're going in there, you're like, what are the 5 champions my team has? And what are the 5 champions that my enemy team has, right? And then you think about what jungler you are playing. If you're playing something like Jarvan, or Xin Zhao, or Lee Sin, it's going to be a very different experience from playing something like Lilia, or Graves, or Fiddlesticks, or Evelynn. There's a lot of different variants, and depending on what champions your team has and what lanes they're assigned to, it's going to change what you can and cannot do. And that's what's cool about League, because there's like basically an infinitely replicable amount of situations that changes your decision making, right? The point of this is to get into the mindset of thinking about these different champions, and then it allows you to kind of build your playbook. This is why it's generally well regarded to play the same champion over and over, because it narrows down all these possibilities, because otherwise there would be too many and pattern recognition in games would be a little bit harder. So here's a quick checklist of things you should be thinking of in the first 4 minutes of the game. These are lane matchups, your jungle matchups, wave states that are happening and what wave states that your teammates are playing for, optimal clears for both junglers because they are different for all junglers, skirmish potentials, and the list goes on. Right? But these are the 5 main things I would keep in mind. So we're going to break each one of them down. Let's start with lane matchups. So the first thing is, when you're loading to game, think about each matchup. For the first clear, right, you should be pathing towards a winning lane and one that should generally net you a crab. It depends on the meta and depending on how important crab is overall, but generally speaking, you want to path towards a winning lane. The reason for this is because this overall will get you a higher percentage chance of being able to make a play. So let's say you have a laner like Darius. This is a great example in solo queue at a basic level in order of a laner that demands or that allows you to play for topside, because Darius is very strong in the early game. That's his specialty, and he wins most matchups. So if anything, if shit ever goes down, Darius is there to help you, and well, hopefully at least, and he can use his early game power to net you plays across the map. This is especially apparent in the early games of professional play, because having early game pressure basically negates the early game capabilities of the enemy team, which is why it's so important. However, just because your lane is winning doesn't mean it's always the lane you should path for. This is a little bit counterintuitive for sure, because sometimes even though you have that Darius, it's more important that you have it's more important that you play for a certain bottom lane. So that's where the idea of having certain matchups is very important. So let's say, for example, you have a bottom lane that's is going to scrap each other for sure, and whoever wins the first sort of duel in that case is going to win the game, regardless of how important your Darius, how fed your Darius is rather. And because of something like this, it kind of changes your priorities. Oh, should I actually path top? Maybe I could path bot. Maybe I can 3-camp bot and then stay bot for the first minute, because on waves 1 through 3, this is the most important phase for this matchup. This is where you can kind of take the baseline that I've given you here and add additional depth. And that's where you use your game knowledge of certain champions and win conditions in order to add on to that. Jungle matchups also matters. Not like an insane amount, but it does matter, right? Because if you're obviously losing in jungle in the early game, it does change what you can and cannot do, right? And if you're like Fiddlesticks or something and you're facing against like Jarvan or Elise, it's very hard to really do too much. Like you're probably not going to counter jungle the enemy, because if you run into them, you're probably going to die. Or if you are like the invading type jungler, maybe you can try for it. Or if it's like a really tough matchup and you need your mid laner as well. Like these are things to kind of consider. And then you also have to consider whether it's even good for your jungler as well. Because some junglers, they don't like clearing, or they don't need economy, like Lee Sin or Jarvan, right? These are facilitator champions that don't need a lot of resources to be useful, versus champions like Lilia or Fiddlesticks or Evelynn, who do need to farm, and they need their clear speed. They need to make use of their clear speed in order to be really effective. They need money, and they love cycling camps. So there's these two different styles, primarily between certain types of jungle champions. So allowing yourself to kind of get a feel for both and understand what you like can help you define not only how to play jungle matchups, but also define your playstyle. Next is wave states, and this is a super important one because honestly, at the end of the day, League is a game about waves. And early, mid, late, it's all about the waves, making decisions around waves, because this is money, this is XP, this is the most consistent and guaranteed way to secure income and growth within your games. And understanding what the implications of waves are in terms of when people have to cash them, what timers this generates, manipulating them, how that affects your matchup. Right? If you're being able to not only clear, but also look around the map and see how the waves are doing and identify potential opportunities or places where you're needed, this is an example of what will push you to the upper echelons of jungle right off the bat. So for example, a classic example of this is enemies pushing their wave. It's a little bit overextended. It's towards your team side. Maybe there's a good gank angle, right? But the evolution of that would be if your bottom lane matchup doesn't allow you to get a good gank off, maybe it's not so good. Or maybe the enemy is building a slow push and you identify that they are, then you can alter your pathing to prevent something like a dive on top if they're building a slow push like that. So this is where early game plays this is the basis for early game plays in League of Legends. We can touch on optimal clears as well, because I kind of touched on it a little bit with champs like Jarvan and Lee Sin versus full clear champions, or maybe champions that love counter jungling as well, like Graves or Kindred, things like this. The other important factor is to think about the potential skirmish that happens as a result, and this ties into a big skill in League called situation assessment. The idea is potential fights change based on where each jungler has started, what possibilities are there. If you started on the same side, if you started on opposite sides, can you counter jungle? Are you fighting for a common objective? Are you playing for the same matchup, right? Thinking about these interactions is something that's going to take a lot of bandwidth, and you have to balance between both clearing very effectively and scanning around very effectively and doing all these things, and thinking about what happens if your team champions interact. So jungle actually has a handful of different things to think about, but it's really cool because you have the opportunity to make a huge impact in all of your games. So here's a quick example simulation if you have a couple of friends that you'd like to try something else like this. This would be played on the Rift, and it would require 2 top laners and 2 junglers, but this can be substituted with any lane as long as you have 1 set of laners and 1 set of junglers. Basically, the win conditions here are if the team that gets first blood wins and can be off a gank or a solo kill, or the team to get the crab also wins. And you have to choose which crab you're fighting for. Like, you have to agree upon which crab, right? Either condition can be met to win. So basically, the game starts as normal, and both laners and junglers will start as normal. Junglers can choose to gank at any time, and choose any path and play for whatever they think is a good win condition. So they can play for the kill, they can play for a skirmish, they can manipulate waves. It involves every skill that I've just talked about, and they can play for crab. So this is basically a simulation of the entire early game, isolated for a single lane. And then if you master this exercise, you basically extrapolate it to your actual games, and you'll notice that it's actually very similar. So this is the format that I like to use as a really good example. And that's pretty much the format for the first path. So hopefully this was super insightful to you guys. And if you have any questions about this, I understand that juggling is actually something that takes a lot of work to get used to. And I would love to answer any of your questions in the comments and things like that, because I think this is a cool thing to have a discussion about and to basically learn more about, so that people can spread this knowledge around. So hopefully this lecture was helpful to you guys. I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.